Hi there. In this lecture, we're going to look at pop art, and for a time, really try and understand artists' attitudes toward comics as they were changing. They really were trying to use comics to get at popular culture, which had, for the large part of fine art, really gone under the radar. There is a long history of anti-graphic narrative bias that modern artists especially felt important to push back against popular culture. Virginia Woolf in the 1920s wrote in an essay, "A storytelling picture is as pathetic and ludicrous as a trick played by a dog, and we applaud it only because we know that it is hard for a painter to tell a story with a brush as it is for a sheepdog to balance a biscuit on its nose." This condescending and derogatory attitude toward narrative art is something that didn't begin with Virginia Woolf. Really probably goes back further to the aestheticists in Britain. James McNeill Whistler in the 1870s began a movement really rejecting the idea that art had a message to tell or a narrative to speak of, and really insisted that art was all about art. And this attitude, although it was refuted at the time, slowly became the new normal. It's not until the 1950s that we start to see artists who are willing to really engage in popular medium and find out this fascination, even though for decades we know artists, even such luminaries as Picasso, were fascinated with American comics. One of the early artists to make art from comics was an artist known simply as Jess, his last name being Collins. Jess Collins, or Jess, was a nuclear physicist who worked at Los Alamos, and he had an epiphany when working on the atomic bomb that all life and civilization could end at any moment, and he might as well just get on with his life and do the things that really mattered to him. So he moved to San Francisco, was openly gay, and began making art. Jess took a fascination in Dick Tracy with its especially strange graphic style and film noir characters, and he started to cut and paste them together very carefully. And from this, he started to create a series of collaged comics he called the Tricky Cad, which is based on Dick Tracy. Now, he really respected the artist who made Dick Tracy and sent him a letter asking permission to show this work. He received an insulting reply, and he never presented these works in public during his lifetime. We can see what he called paste-ups were very carefully cut and assembled to make it seem like you were actually looking at a real comic. But the combination and density and the strangeness of the images is clearly a fabrication. He was chiefly inspired by the surrealist Max Ernst, who had used popular materials to create a pseudo-narrative of ambiguous alchemical symbolism called A Week of Kindness. Tricky Cad really provides a really fascinating view of looking at something that should be readable, should be a comic, but is fundamentally not. And through that disjuncture, we are forced to look at the mechanism and the way in which comics work on our imagination. Another artist who was a professional cartoonist and had been making cartoons and humorous illustrations during the war was Saul Steinberg. Saul Steinberg immigrated to the US in the 1940s and began making cartoons for the New York magazines. In New York, he was a well-connected man who became well-known with very high-end art circles, and actually was one of the very few artists to exhibit alongside fine artists in New York. His art always had something to do with the nature of communication, the way signs take on meaning, the way shapes communicate feeling or expression, the way language devolves into mere visual patterns. And his art is always, in a sense, self-referential. It's making itself. It is a meta-commentary on the idea of art making. One of the things that he did really well was to contrasting styles and use comic characters as a way to comment on the way we perceive ourselves, the way we see ourselves in society, and how we imagine ourselves in relationship to other people. His work for a period in the 60s took on this crazy patterning of comics. And although they are not actual comics, he just was fascinated with the emanata and the idea of comics and how comics communicate and the absurdity of the ways in which they work. And so he created these wild panels that spin out and seem to contain endless amounts of action and information. As I said, the way in which he uses language in this visual manner, this is called asemic writing. It's where something is written in such a way that it appears like writing, like a language, but it's entirely invented. It's merely the appearance of language and not language itself. And for Saul Steinberg, this strategy was a way for us, again, to become alienated by the actual words and just take them in as visual information. Another thing that Saul Steinberg was especially keen at representing was this way in which danger and cute and violence and terror were all mixed together. This sort of fascination and misunderstanding that comes with the real dangers of the modern world. Pop art properly begins with a group of artists in Britain. Richard Hamilton was one of this group, and he began creating collages that criticized and commented on the vacuous nature of American culture that was spilling over across the Atlantic and vacuating all meaning in its path. So here in this long worded title, just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing? The title is taken from an advertisement, and virtually all the things we see in the collage are also parts of advertisements. And we see the way in which the ads communicate sexuality and excitement and material wealth and well-being. All of the burlesque dancer, the muscle builder, the sense of excess. And if you look through the window, you can see Al Jolson playing the jazz singer, the sense of outrageous and ridiculous, all piled on top of each other. And interestingly enough, on the back wall, you'll notice that a page from a comic book has been placed there as if it is art. If we look at that image, we can see that it is actually Young Romance, True Love Stories by Jack Kirby, our creator of Captain America and other important Marvel heroes. He, during the 1950s, jumped on board the newly popular romance comics and began doing a number of those stories. Young Romance, in the context of pop art, is meant to comment on not the new maturity of comics, comics that were now being made for adults, but actually to talk about the emptiness and the lack of signification, the lack of any real meaning that these comics had. And in this sense, there's a condescension and a dismissal of the art of comics. We also see that the bodybuilder is a common trope in comics. If you remember from long ago, the very familiar image of Charles Atlas, the bodybuilder, and the ad with the comic showing the scrawny weakling joining this organization and learning how to be a bodybuilder and come back and made a man out of Mac. And this whole story, this transformation in the comic is itself a kind of reflection of the superhero narrative. And the bodybuilder is such an important idea in so many of the sort of superhero narratives that are being pushed through the comics in America. The other artist who started to take up comic pages is Roy Lichtenstein, and he has become very famous for his copies of comic pages. And this has become a really fascinating way in which he has really demonstrated the way comics work. He began his career early in 1963, and he very quickly rose to prominence doing these imitations of comic pages. Over the years, he moved away from comics and began to do imitations of other kinds of work, but always with this sense of exaggeration and a sense of superficiality to the thing that he was copying. So here, Wham! From 1963 is a part of an actual comic that he took into his things. You can see a really interesting combination. David Barlow has created a huge web page called Deconstructing Roy Lichtenstein, where he shows us Roy Lichtenstein's painting on one side, and we see the actual comic on the other. And it's really interesting to note the changes in the way in which Lichtenstein reinterpreted the comic page. Now, the way Roy Lichtenstein worked was he didn't want to actually copy the actual art onto his paintings. He starts out, he finds a panel he likes, for some reason it interests him, and then he goes about and he does a drawing of that panel. He's simplifying, he's a little exaggerating the panel, and then it's his drawing, his interpretation of that comic panel that he then blows up onto a very large canvas. His early work, he was actually working on metal. He didn't want it to have any kind of recognizable surface or texture to indicate that it was, in fact, a painting. So in this case here, he took the panel and really altered it quite a bit. He flipped it over, changed the words, and redesigned it in quite a different way. Over time, though, his changes to the image become fewer and fewer, and he's mostly just simplifying the image, creating a bolder, simpler graphic style, and then slowly exaggerating the colors and the dots that make up those colors. If you look at it, you'll notice that the lettering is different. He's changing some of the text. He's trying to communicate this idea that the comic is bold and outrageous and not at all like real life. And unfortunately, the actual comics are drawn with a great deal more sensitivity and sophistication than his imitations would let on. The actual artists that he imitated, Russ Heath, Irv Novak, were men who served in the military. And one interesting story was that Russ Heath was actually a commanding officer, and one day he met with this private, Roy Lichtenstein, who was absolutely miserable peeling potatoes, and he got him a job doing some kind of artwork in the station. But you can see Russ Heath and Irv Novak are very sophisticated artists who worked tirelessly to create realistic, believable, emotionally intense comics. And they would typically get paid about $25 to $35 a page. Roy Lichtenstein, on the other hand, was making $30,000 to $50,000 for one of their panels. And we can see that Roy Lichtenstein really doesn't quite draw as well as the original comic artists. There's a stiffness, there's a forced awkwardness, and he really emphasizes the Ben-Day dots. That thing that is sort of visible, he makes it out to be a heavy pattern. Jack Kirby was also commonly copied by Roy Lichtenstein. Kirby would resent the imitation and would adjust his style. We'll talk more about that when we get to his work in the Silver Age.